Hello everybody and welcome to another week of wonderful Porsches here on the channel. Today a car I've been trying to track down for quite some time. Now I very nearly reviewed this car last year, but circumstances conspired against us and so we've had to wait until now. But I am very glad to say at long last I am able to drive Ian's 1993 Porsche 968 Clubsport. Now the 968 is in of itself a very curious car. We all forget, as Porsche now the big dog of the sports car world, that back in the early 1990s they were essentially broke. The 911 was absolutely ancient, as was indeed the rest of their model lineup, and they weren't really selling. The 944 had been introduced in 1982 and was already getting close to a decade old and was not a very good seller. Porsche knew they couldn't really afford to replace the model outright. You had the 928 alongside it, which was even more ancient and very expensive, and they knew big things had to happen, but they didn't have the money for it quite yet. And so they are working on a third iteration of the 944 to replace the S2. As they went along though, they wound up replacing enough parts, they decided to rename the entire thing and introduce it as a new model. Now they claim that 80% of this car is different to the 944 which preceded it. I'm not entirely sure that's strictly true, but it certainly looked different just enough to keep the model going for a little bit longer until the Boxster arrived and the new era of Porsche could truly begin. Now the 968, it's fair to say, was not really much of a success, particularly not in places like Britain where it was quite expensive for a four-cylinder car and had to compete with, on paper, much better equipped cars like the BMW M3. So Porsche decided to try something a little bit unusual with this car. They created the Clubsport, and the recipe for that was simple. They looked at the 968, they grabbed a load of bits and chucked them in the bin. That included things like the air conditioning, the electric windows, the electric release for the tailgate, some of the covers in the engine bay, even the airbags. Yes, this comes from a time when you could quite legally delete the airbags in a car. The result was a car which was some 50 to 100 kilos, depending on who you listen to, lighter than standard. You also got, to make this car a little bit sportier, a few additions, like these beautiful Recaro seats, which were painted in a colour to match the exterior. You had some decals on the side, larger and wider 17-inch wheels, and a lower and stiffer suspension. The idea was that this was therefore a faster, more capable car, and, shock of all shocks, it was cheaper than the standard car too. As a result, the Clubsport actually sold reasonably well, probably one of the more popular versions of the 968 here in the UK. I think it's fair to say that this car has something of a cult status, very easily identified by the big graphics on the side, which you could delete at no cost, but I think do kind of suit it. Because of the round headlights and sort of smoothed off front, which look a bit like the 993, a lot of people will mistake this car for a 928. I always felt like the 944 and 968 were much better looking cars. The 928 to me always looked a little bit soft and rounded. This is also a very different car to drive and to be in comparison with the 928. That is clearly a real luxury GT car, and it's very obvious even at low speeds that this is more of a focused sports car. Now this has a couple of factory spec upgrades to it. It's got the MO30, which is essentially Porsche code for sport, suspension and brakes. I believe even as standard these cars carried the brakes from the old 944 Turbo S. So in theory they should be able to stop it. And tyres were quite a bit wider than standard as well. I think it was 205 and 225 on the regular car, 225 and 255s on this. You sit higher than you do in a 928, and that you feel like you're really low slung, whereas this I'm actually pretty higher than I thought that I might want to be. You've got a great view out the front and indeed the rear, and this car is actually quite practical too, but we'll get onto that later. What you really want to know, and conveniently what I also want to find out, is how this car copes with a reasonably difficult and today slightly damp but beautiful Scottish B road. So let's have a go, shall we? 6-speed gearbox is an absolute delight, replacing the old 5-speeder that you got in the 944 S2. It's short, it's direct, much better than I expected it to be. Now you can tell that ultimate grip is not this car's forte. Even at low speeds, the front can wash wide just a little bit. But I have to say, it's a joy to pedal down this road. You can place it really nicely, and the steering is really surprisingly direct. It's got a nice weighting to it, and the front end is very darty. Now it is firm, very firm. Perhaps a little more so than it should be, but I can forgive it for that. The engine is, well, not the most powerful, but it's responsive and it's keen to please, even if it isn't that effective. But for enjoying on a road like this, it has ample power. It was one of the largest 4-cylinder engines ever produced at 3 litres, and I've no doubt whatsoever that fact was probably something that really didn't help sales. After all, back in 1993 when this car came out, nobody cared all that much about how much fuel you used, but they did care about how many cylinders you had in your car. Indeed, I believe my dad actually wanted to buy one of these back in the mid-90s, but he just couldn't justify this much money for a car with 2 less cylinders than the M3 he ultimately bought. He also put his back out, which meant that getting in and out of one of these just wasn't going to work. There was also, I think possibly just for the UK market, a sport version of one of these, which was essentially a Clubsport, but with some of the luxury stuff chucked back in again for good measure. Now fortunately, this section of the road has dried out somewhat, and you can really play with the car. Yeah, it's not that quick, it just isn't, but I entirely forgive it that. I've no real particular interest in going that fast these days. This is quick enough for me, and it's narrow enough that you can really have fun, and it's brilliant how delicate it is. Heel and toe is really nice, or actually that's not heel and toe, that's just rev matching, to be fair. I do know a couple of people have commented and wonder why I always talk about how easy it is to heel and toe in a car. Well, for me, it's a part of the driving experience. Also, I think it's a bit of mechanical sympathy towards the car, so it means something to me, okay? You don't have to do it if you don't want to, but I like to do it. Sound deadening was also something that was stripped away in part from this car, and you can tell because there's quite a bit of road noise coming through, and you probably appreciate that from the audio. But really, it actually feels quite solid, and I do know that Ian spent quite a bit of money on this car. You see, the 928 has a reputation for being unreasonably expensive to maintain, and I would love to be able to tell you that the 968, confusingly named though it may be, is a lot cheaper and easier to run. And it probably is. Unfortunately, this car hasn't been the best. It has needed towing on multiple occasions, and it's also needed a clutch, which was much more expensive than you think it should be, and it even had to have the engine out for some work. Parts availability is apparently now becoming something of an issue, so if you are thinking of buying one of these cars, and it certainly does get my recommendation, just make sure it's a good one, because things that you think might be easy perhaps won't be. It's an important car in Porsche history. It was the last 4-cylinder they made for about 2 decades, and really, I think this deserved to do a lot better than it did. I've always had a fondness for the old 944 S2 and the turbo, those great looking things. And actually next week, I'm going to be driving a 944 S2. So I've done these in something of the wrong order, but if that car impresses half as much as this has, it's going to be pretty enjoyable. Now, if you are brave enough to face the running costs of one of these, then actually, as a daily driver, it makes a reasonable amount of sense. That is with the proviso that you can make do with only the 2 seats. As standard, there are no back seats in this thing at all. But that means what you have is an enormous load bay. The only downside is that the entirety of that load bay is on display. So don't leave anything valuable in there, because it probably won't be there when you get back. However, as a tool to enjoy these fine and beautiful country roads, it really is quite a thing. Gearbox is great, and actually a 6-speed gearbox back in the early 90s, probably quite a fancy thing. In fact, when this car was on sale, you'd have to spend about £170,000 on a Ferrari to get a 6-speed box, because the 348 was still on a 5-speeder. Weights up so nicely. Transaxle car, meaning the gearbox is at the back for the quote-unquote perfect 50-50 weight distribution. As it happens, I believe the idea of a 50-50 weight distribution being perfect is utter and total nonsense, but that's a video for another day. What I can say is that the 968 Clubsport is an absolute pleasure. Even the brakes, although these ones I think need a little bit of work, so they're a little bit rumbly and grumbly, but they're nice to modulate. They bring the car to a stop easily and cleanly, and that's what I care about more these days. I know what their ability is, but what's more important to me now is how easy it is to access that. There's no point having the best brakes in the entire world if all they do is just try and throw you and your passenger through the front screen. So there we have it. That is the Porsche 968 Clubsport, and I think a fine way to start a week of beautiful German cars. See you for the next one. Bye-bye.